a decorated Army veteran, spoke the truth at a school board meeting. Days later, he was dragged into court, accused of inciting violence, stripped of his honor, and told to apologize or lose everything. But what if his words weren't dangerous, just inconvenient for those in power? If this story touches you, tap like, share it with someone who still believes in truth, and don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The courtroom was packed. Not just full, but tight, like a chamber holding in too much pressure for too long. Journalists lined the back wall, camera lights dimmed but ready. Veterans sat stiff and silent, their jackets covered in ribbons, hats folded respectfully in their laps. A handful of teenagers slouched in their seats, some angry, some confused. Protesters flanked the courthouse steps outside, half waving flags, half waving signs. Inside, the tension was thick enough to taste. This wasn't just any trial. This was the trial. And at the defense table, seated in a plain gray shirt with no medals, no uniform, was Staff Sergeant Mason Ryland, 41 years old, a 3-tour combat veteran, a Silver Star recipient, a man who had once pulled 2 men out of a burning convoy under enemy fire. Now, he was being tried for a speech, not for what he'd done overseas, but for what he said at a school board meeting in Rockwood, Missouri. The meeting had been about revising patriotic traditions, replacing the Pledge of Allegiance with more inclusive rituals, according to the board's proposal. Ryland had spoken calmly, firmly, for just under 4 minutes. The full recording showed a man speaking about unity, sacrifice, and remembering those who'd served. But the viral clip, the one that made headlines, was only 14 seconds long. If the American flag offends you more than foreign enemies do, then you've forgotten which soil you stand on. That clip, stripped of its context, ignited a firestorm. 3 days later, a group of high school students, none of whom had been at the board meeting, burned foreign flags outside their school and assaulted 2 classmates during an argument in the lunchroom. The story exploded across national media. On one side, outrage over hate-fueled youth violence. On the other, claims that free speech was being scapegoated. And in the middle stood Ryland. He had not endorsed violence. He hadn't even raised his voice. But now he was here, facing a civil lawsuit and a possible criminal inquiry, accused of using public speech in a way that encouraged social division and incited harm among minors. A serious charge, one that could strip him of military benefits, even land him in jail. Presiding over the case was Judge Serena Rowe, known in Missouri for her precise command of the law and her reputation for unshakable neutrality. She had once presided over a case that involved a state senator and not once blinked on the bench. Some called her cold, others called her fair. But today, she looked unsettled, not nervous, never that, but watchful. She scanned the room slowly, pausing just a second longer on Ryland before returning to her notes. The air vibrated with a tension older than the case itself. This wasn't just about a man or a flag or a video. This was about a deeper question. Who decides what truth is too dangerous to say out loud? He once stood in the line of enemy fire. Today he stood in the line of public opinion, and the bullets were headlines, twisted quotes, and half-told truths. They didn't play the full recording. Of course they didn't. Instead, on every channel and platform, they looped the same 14 seconds. If the flag offends you more than foreign enemies do, then you've forgotten which soil you stand on. No mention of what came before. No context. No explanation. Not the part where Ryland talked about his best friend, killed in Afghanistan, who carried a small flag folded in his chest pocket. Not the part where he said that true patriotism isn't silence or obedience, but sacrifice. Not the part where he warned gently that forgetting the price of freedom might be more dangerous than any offense. Those words didn't trend, only the punchline did. Somewhere between honesty and outrage, they'd cut the sentence and carved up the man. A week after that meeting, a group of students at Jefferson High set fire to foreign flags outside the school's gym. One even set a classmate's display project on fire, sparking panic and a brief fight in the hallway. The victims were students of color. The attackers claimed they were protecting American values. The media, desperate for a narrative, latched onto Ryland's quote as the spark. That's why he was here now. Not because he told anyone to burn flags, but because someone else did, and they blamed his words for lighting the match. The courtroom watched silently as the viral clip was played again. The audio popped, clipped at both ends. Reporters took notes. One leaned in slightly to catch Ryland's face. He didn't flinch. Then came a voice, firm, though measured. Emily Trent, public school teacher, 21 years in the district, stood slowly from the gallery. I was at that meeting, 2 rows behind Sergeant Ryland. I recorded the whole thing on my phone, not just the clip they're using. He didn't raise his voice, didn't attack anyone. He talked about service, about remembering those who never came home. She hesitated. I sent the full clip to 2 local stations, and neither of them ever called me back. Judge Rowe gave a slow, unreadable nod. Then another voice, soft, uncertain. Carlos Whitmore, 17, a senior at Jefferson High, stood awkwardly near the back. I was there too. I came for extra credit. I didn't understand most of the policy talk, but I remember what he said. He didn't tell anyone to fight. He said freedom meant respecting those who gave it to us. That's all. Someone at the press table coughed, sharp, skeptical. Judge Rowe tapped her gavel once. Order held, but only just. Ryland remained still, not ashamed, but perhaps mourning, not just what had been said, but what had been lost in translation. The truth is never too long, unless someone needs it short enough to fit a headline. The courtroom recessed. But outside the public eye, a different kind of pressure began to build. In a side room, Ryland sat across from 2 people, his lawyer, Jordan Seal, and a woman in a government badge. Not a judge, not press, just power in a blazer. She didn't waste words. He issues a public apology, acknowledges his statement may have caused confusion, and this ends quietly. Jordan stayed calm. And if he doesn't? Civil suit moves forward, criminal investigation opens, loss of pension, benefits under review. This goes federal if it needs to. She paused. We're offering him a door. Tell him to walk through it. Silence. Jordan turned to Ryland. It doesn't mean you're guilty. Just politically smart. You say something neutral, keep your record clean, you move on. Ryland didn't respond. His hands were still, but his jaw clenched. Just once. The woman leaned in. It's not personal. It's just what the public needs right now. Still no answer. Jordan's voice lowered. Mason, this isn't war. This is survival. Ryland finally looked up. His voice was quiet, steady. Then maybe I've been trained for the wrong battlefield. The woman sighed. Jordan closed his file. No decision was made. But the pressure? It stayed in the room. When court resumed, the next name called stopped Ryland cold. Mr. Alan Drake, please take the stand. The room shifted. Ryland turned slightly, just enough to catch the man walking down the center aisle. Broad shoulders, slightly hunched, limp in the left leg. Face older than the years should explain. Alan Drake. A name from another life. A name Ryland hadn't spoken since the dust of Kandahar. They had served together, 200 days, 7 firefights, 2 body bags they carried side by side. Fire team partners. Brothers in the deepest sense of the word. There was a time when Alan would have taken a bullet for Ryland. And Ryland? He had once dragged Alan out of a burning convoy, blood pouring down his thigh, breath shallow but stubborn. You good? Still breathing, Alan had grunted. Guess I'll limp with character. That day felt like 100 years ago now. Drake took the witness stand. The oath was routine. The silence that followed was not. He looked across the courtroom, eyes skimming past reporters and spectators until they landed on one face. Mason Ryland. Alan's voice was steady, but low. I served with Sergeant Ryland, 3rd Battalion, Kandahar. We shared more than a uniform. We shared decisions no one wants to remember. He paused, let the words sit. I came home with a limp, some medals, and a brain I didn't trust anymore. The Army gave me pills. The VA gave me waiting lists. My wife gave me divorce papers. His voice tightened, not with anger, but with fatigue. The kind that clings to you long after the gunfire stops. Ryland, he got invited to speak at events, got handshakes, got framed flags. I got forgotten. Another pause, this time longer. He stood in front of that school board and said, if the flag offends you more than foreign enemies do, you've forgotten which soil you stand on. He looked down for a moment. You know what offends me? Seeing that clip over and over, hearing people chant it like a slogan, watching teenagers burn flags at my old high school because they thought that was patriotism. He leaned slightly toward the mic. The courtroom leaned with him. He doesn't know what it's like to wake up gasping in your own living room. He doesn't know the weight of silence in a bottle of pills. He doesn't know what it's like to scream in your head so loud you can't hear your own daughter. Ryland's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Didn't blink. Alan looked straight at him. You got to be the voice. I became the warning label. His voice cracked, just slightly. You want to talk about soil, Mason? I stand on the kind that forgets its veterans. The kind that covers coffins with flags and calls that closure. A long silence followed. No outbursts, no gavel, just a stillness that wrapped around the room like fog. Judge Rowe's eyes flicked to Ryland, who hadn't moved, but something in him had. In his mind, Ryland saw a different courtroom, one made of sand and blood and heat. He remembered Alan's voice, raspy but calm, as they crouched behind a broken wall in a firefight. Don't die on me, man. Not planning to. And now here he was, alive but hollowed out, testifying not against a stranger, but a brother. Not out of hate, but out of pain. Ryland lowered his gaze, not in shame, not in defeat, but in something far more complicated, something only war could carve. Loss that didn't come from bullets, but from belief left unanswered for too long. The ones who turn against what they once believed aren't always traitors. Sometimes they're just the ones who carried too much for too long and broke somewhere no one could see. The hotel room was quiet, too quiet for someone used to sleeping next to gunfire, sandstorms, or the low hum of a breathing brother in arms. Mason Ryland sat at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, unmoving. One boot still untied. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly, like they didn't know what to hold on to anymore. It was almost midnight. The hearing would resume in the morning. The public statement, the final ruling, the media frenzy, it would all come crashing down by noon. And in his jacket pocket was a folded envelope, creased from being opened and refolded too many times. Corners softened from war and time, ink faded, but never forgotten. He didn't need to open it, he'd memorized every line. But tonight, he did anyway. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it, the paper making the faintest sound in the silence, like dry leaves in autumn wind. Hey Sarge, if you're reading this, I guess something went sideways. I'm not scared. I just didn't want to leave without saying something real. It was from Corporal Henry Langston, 19 years old, barely a man. Smart, too kind for war. The kind of kid who still mailed birthday cards to his mother even from a forward operating base. Ryland remembered the way Langston used to talk about opening a bar back home. Said he'd call it the mess hall, and every beer would be named after an inside joke only veterans would get. He died 2 months before rotation, right there in Ryland's arms. Ryland stood and walked toward the mirror. He didn't look yet, just stood there, the letter still in hand. Tell them I loved this country, even if it didn't love me back. That line always hit the hardest, every time. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't poetic. It was raw, honest. Langston hadn't meant it as bitterness. He meant it as loyalty, the kind that doesn't change when it isn't returned. Ryland looked into the mirror now and saw someone he barely recognized. He still had the frame of a soldier, the stance, the eyes that never fully blinked, but something in his face looked older than his years, like a man stretched too long across too many fronts. He sat back down, the letter resting on the desk beside him now. He let the silence in the room breathe. His lawyer had offered to write the apology for him. You don't have to mean it, he'd said. You just have to say it. The government had made their position clear. Apologize, or lose everything you've earned. And the public, they weren't listening. They were reacting, scrolling, choosing sides, shouting into timelines. No one wanted the full story, just a soundbite that fit their narrative. Ryland leaned forward, elbows on the desk, head in his hands. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of fighting battles that didn't come with medals. Tired of trying to hold the line when the line kept moving. He whispered, not to anyone, but to the letter. You died in a place most people can't pronounce, for a country that still argues over whether you mattered. The room didn't answer, just the hum of the mini fridge and the low hiss of the heater. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he thought about giving in, about reading the statement they'd prepared, about surviving quietly, about disappearing. But then he remembered Langston's face. Not when he died, but before. In the mess tent, laughing. In the field, helping a local kid fix a broken bike. On patrol, humming songs that didn't belong in a war zone. Langston had believed, not in politics, not in image, but in people. In the idea that service was a promise, not a performance. Ryland opened his eyes again, slower this time. He looked at the letter, at the words, "Tell them I loved this country." He stood up, pulled his jacket on. The knot in his stomach hadn't disappeared. The fear was still there, quiet but very real. But something else sat beside it now. Resolve. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into his chest pocket, the same place Langston had carried his flag. Not for symbolism, not for attention, but because some things belong close to your heart, or they lose meaning altogether. He walked over to the window. The city below was still alive. Cars, lights, late-night deliveries. The world hadn't paused. It never did. But Ryland had. Just long enough to remember why he couldn't walk away. Some stories aren't written in ink. They're written in blood. And if I stay silent, who's left to tell them? The courtroom settled. Slowly. All eyes turned to Mason Ryland. He stood, deliberate, calm, measured. His suit wasn't perfect. His tie slightly off. But the way he carried himself, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering, it felt like a man walking into a firefight. Not to win, but to say he didn't fear the bullets. Judge Serena Rowe adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Ryland," she began, "before we proceed with final arguments, you have the opportunity to issue a statement of apology to the board, the families affected by the school incident, and the broader community." Her voice was level, formal. But there was something beneath it, like she already knew what was coming and didn't want to hear it. Ryland stepped forward, hands clasped loosely. He didn't touch the microphone, didn't need it. "I understand the offer before me," he said. "A chance to end this quietly, save face, avoid escalation." He looked around the courtroom, at the press, at the parents, at the row of veterans seated behind the defense table, some watching him with quiet hope, others with guarded doubt. "But I didn't come here to avoid escalation. I came to see how far we've fallen." Gasps were swallowed. Pens stopped moving. A reporter dropped her stylus. Judge Rowe leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Ryland, you are under oath. You understand this court's authority." He nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, and I respect this court." His voice didn't rise. In fact, it lowered. Slower. Heavier. "But you're asking me to apologize for a sentence pulled from a speech no one bothered to finish. You're asking me to say that words honoring the fallen are dangerous." He turned to the gallery. "You're not angry because I was disrespectful. You're angry because I reminded people what respect costs." Murmurs rippled. Judge Rowe tapped her gavel. "This is not a platform, Sergeant. This is a court of law." Ryland didn't flinch. "Then let the record show I will not apologize." She stared at him. The room held its breath. "You are refusing a lawful directive?" "I'm refusing to rewrite my convictions to suit public comfort." The judge's voice sharpened. "You do understand the consequences. We can hold you in contempt." He nodded again, slower this time. "You may charge me with contempt, but don't ask me to betray the dead." Silence. Real silence. Not respectful. Not tense. Just stunned. Because no one in that room, not the judge, not the attorneys, not the cameras, expected defiance to sound so quiet, so final. Judge Rowe stared at him for a moment longer, then leaned back in her chair. Her fingers wrapped the gavel, but she didn't raise it yet. Ryland turned back to the bench. His tone softened, but the weight only deepened. "I watched friends bleed out for this country. I held the hands of men who knew they wouldn't see sunrise, and none of them asked who I voted for. None of them cared what color my skin was. None of them asked which slogan was trending that week. They just served." He paused. His eyes scanned the back of the room, as if seeing something beyond walls and wood panels. "I stood by a flag when it was full of holes, and I'll be damned if I apologize for asking this country to remember who patched it." A woman in the back row, a Gold Star mother, brought her hand to her mouth. The judge looked down at her notes, then back at him. "This court is not interested in personal philosophy." Ryland stepped slightly closer, still behind the line, still within protocol. But the room shifted with him. "This isn't personal philosophy. This is the difference between performance and principle. You're not just asking me to say I was wrong. You're asking me to agree that honoring sacrifice is somehow offensive now. And I won't." The judge raised her gavel, but stopped halfway. Her fingers gripped it tightly, her jaw set. But still, she didn't strike, because there was no order left to restore, just a reckoning hanging in the air. Ryland exhaled, not in relief, not in victory, In release, he had said what needed to be said, and whatever happened next wouldn't change that. There are trials where one man is judged, but sometimes a courtroom hands down a verdict on an entire generation that forgot how to say thank you. The room was still carrying the weight of Ryland's refusal. Judge Rowe had not struck her gavel. The air felt suspended. A bailiff leaned in, whispering something to the clerk. The judge raised an eyebrow. "There's one more witness request, Your Honor, from the gallery. It wasn't on the original list." Rowe frowned. "A surprise witness? A minor. He's here with his guardian, says he was present at the school board meeting." Rowe looked out across the courtroom, squinting past the heads and shadows. A small voice spoke up. "That was me." He stood slowly. Thin frame, nervous hands, just a kid in a blue shirt, khakis, and scuffed sneakers. 14, maybe younger. But when he stepped forward, there was something about his pace, not too fast, not too scared, that made the whole room lean in. "Name?" the clerk asked. "Marcus Langston." Ryland turned slightly. Langston. It hit like a name you hadn't said aloud in years, a name you carried with reverence. This was Corporal Langston's son, the same Langston who died in Ryland's arms, the same one who used to joke about raising a son smarter than both of them. And now, that boy stood in the center of a courtroom, facing adults who had talked over his father's memory for days. He took the stand, small hands, legs barely reaching the floor. He adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, then looked straight at the judge. "I went to the school board meeting with my dad. He brought me because he said I needed to hear people talk about the country he was fighting for. I sat behind Sergeant Ryland. I remember because he gave me a peppermint before it started. Said, 'No falling asleep during democracy, deal?'" The room chuckled lightly. Tension broke, but only for a breath. He didn't yell. He didn't point fingers. He said we shouldn't forget soldiers, that's all. He told the board that changing the pledge was okay, but forgetting sacrifice wasn't. He looked down for a second, then back up. "But when I saw the video later online, it was different. It wasn't what I heard. It sounded mean." But he wasn't mean. The video cut out the part where he said, "We honor freedom by honoring those who gave it to us." The courtroom was silent again. Judge Rowe leaned forward. "Marcus, why do you want to testify today?" The boy hesitated, swallowed. Then, with a voice steadier than anyone expected, he said, "Because the grown-ups keep arguing about what he said. But I was there. I heard everything." He turned just slightly toward the press row. "You all wrote articles about what he said, but none of you asked me what I heard." He looked toward Ryland. Ryland said we have to remember people like my dad, but people cut that part out and then blamed him for things he didn't say. "I came here today because I remember." Ryland blinked, the first visible emotion he'd shown since the trial began. His jaw tightened, then loosened again. One hand curled around the armrest slowly, not in anger, in awe. Judge Rowe sat back in her chair. Her fingers, usually poised and firm, rested gently on the desk now, not tense, just still. No one spoke. Because what do you say when a 14-year-old delivers more truth than a courtroom full of adults? Marcus looked down at his lap, fiddled with his sleeve. Then he added, barely above a whisper, "I miss my dad, but I think he'd be proud that I told the truth." A reporter in the third row lowered his pen, quietly put it down. Someone in the veterans section let out a shaky breath. Another brushed away a tear with the back of his hand. And Ryland? He placed one hand over his chest pocket, right over the letter. The judge was still processing what Marcus Langston had said. The boy had returned to his seat beside his guardian, head slightly bowed, but his words still echoed, not in volume, but in weight. The courtroom was quieter now, not silent out of tension, silent out of something closer to reverence. Then, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, not slammed, not creaked, just opened, and in walked a man. He was tall, straight-backed, gray at the temples, wearing a full military dress uniform, rows of ribbons across his chest, polished black shoes, cap tucked under one arm. He didn't say a word. But the moment he entered, half the veterans in the gallery straightened. The kind of movement that isn't conscious, it's instinct. Major General Callum Price. Ryland turned at the sound, and froze. It was him. Callum Price, his former commanding officer. A man who once led thousands into battle and walked alongside them instead of above them. They hadn't spoken in years. No one had called him. No one expected him. And yet, there he was, walking down the aisle, calm, certain. He didn't approach the bench. He didn't sit in the gallery. Instead, he stopped in the very center of the room, right between judge and defendant. He turned, faced Ryland, and then he saluted. Sharp, precise, not a performance. Just a gesture of recognition from one soldier to another. The room stilled again. Ryland's eyes met his. No words passed, none were needed. Because in that moment, every person in that room understood exactly what was being said, without a single sound. The salute wasn't for politics. It wasn't for defiance. It wasn't even for the crowd. It was for conviction. For standing when it would have been easier to sit. For speaking when it would have been safer to stay silent. Then it happened. One of the veterans in the back row stood. Then another. Then a third, older, walking with a cane. One by one they rose. No commands, no glances, just a shared understanding that spread like a quiet flame. A teacher near the jury stood. A student. A mother in a floral dress. Even a reporter, one who had spent the week writing stories half told, put down her tablet and slowly rose to her feet. They didn't rise for drama. They rose because truth had been spoken. And some truths don't let you sit still. Judge Rowe's eyes scanned the room. She didn't raise her gavel. She didn't interrupt. She just watched it happen. Watched the shift she couldn't command. Watched a room no longer hers, but his. Ryland stood straighter now. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just nodded once to the man who'd saluted him. And General Price nodded back, then took a seat in the gallery, without a word, without fanfare. Because the message had already landed. Judge Rowe hadn't moved for a long moment. The courtroom remained standing, not in protest, not in tribute, in something else entirely. Conviction, memory, reckoning. Then, slowly, she adjusted the microphone before her. She looked down at her notes, though everyone knew she wouldn't need them. Her voice, when it came, was steady, tired, but steady. In light of today's testimony and the effect it has had on the proceedings, this court will rescind the formal order of apology previously placed upon the defendant. A wave of quiet disbelief moved through the room. Ryland didn't move. Rowe continued. Let the record reflect that this decision does not constitute agreement with Mr. Ryland's original statements. The court finds the content of said remarks provocative and potentially divisive. However, we recognize that freedom of speech, even when uncomfortable, is not optional. It is constitutional. She paused. Her eyes flicked toward Ryland. This ruling is not an endorsement of tone. It is a protection of principle. Ryland gave a single nod, no smile, no fist pump, just acknowledgement. Because this wasn't a win. It was a reminder. The judge gathered her papers. The gavel tapped once. This court is adjourned. That was it. No thunderous moment. No dramatic exit. Just closure and consequence. The reporters moved first. They surged as Ryland stepped toward the doors. Cameras clicked, flashes popped, microphones extended like a wall of noise rushing to break the silence. Mr. Ryland, do you regret what you said? Would you do it again? What would you say to the students involved in the incident? Are you afraid of backlash? He didn't answer at first. He reached the threshold, paused, turned, looked directly at the cameras, and spoke clearly, quietly. I'd rather be blacklisted for loving my country than celebrated for pretending I don't. That was the quote. The one that would lead every headline by nightfall. The one that would be shared, debated, defended, and deconstructed. But more importantly, it was the one no one could edit to change its meaning. Outside the courthouse, a soft wind blew through the crowd. Protest signs rustled. Someone lowered a flag to half-mast, not because of a ruling, but because something in the air felt different now. Not resolved, but recognized. Ryland stepped out into the light, and the world, for a brief second, paused, not out of reverence, but out of understanding. Marcus Langston stood by the courthouse steps, watching, his small hand lifted over his chest, not because someone told him to, not because there was a song playing, just because he remembered what his father had said. And today, he'd seen it carried forward. No applause, no anthem, no roaring victory, just the steady flap of a flag overhead, and a boy's hand over his heart. Ryland looked up at the flag, then down at the steps beneath him. The courthouse doors behind him were already closing. But this wasn't an end. It was a line drawn in quiet stone, not between right and wrong, but between forgetting and remembering. You can be condemned for loving your country too loudly, But if we start punishing loyalty, who's left to love anything at all? If this story moved you, even just a little, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who still believes that truth deserves a voice. Because this wasn't just a courtroom story. It was a reminder that courage isn't always loud, that patriotism isn't a performance, and that silence can sometimes cost more than speaking up. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we bring you stories that don't just entertain, but invite you to feel, reflect, and remember what matters. Your support means the world to us. Every like, every comment, and every subscriber helps our small team keep telling stories that dig a little deeper and reach a little further. So if you believe the world needs more truth, more heart, and more stories that matter, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we honor them.